Okay, hi everybody. I think we'll get started, and as people can sort of filter in, they'll be able to filter in. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you all back to the Sustainable Places Research Seminar Series. It's a very great pleasure to have speaking today Dr. Hushneara Mich. Hush, as she likes to be called, is a former PhD student here at Cardiff who specializes in low carbon procurement within the public sector and is currently director of the Centre for Sustainability, which is a social enterprise that's recently been set up to support organizations and governments transitioning to a pathway towards sustainability through advisory, research, training, services, etc. Hush is also non-executive director for Welsh Government within their Industry Wales arm, and Industry Wales governs all industry within Wales. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. And today, Hush is going to talk about implementation of low carbon procurement to fight against climate change. Just a couple of pieces of business before we go. So we're going to run this as we have our other meetings. So if you have a question, please put that into the chat. And what we will do is at the end of the talk, we will sort of discuss those questions. And also, I just wanted to note for everybody, you will have seen this as you got into Zoom, but we are recording this meeting. And we will post this on the Sustainable Places website after it's occurred. So with no further ado, off you go, Hush. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you, TC, for handing over to myself, and thank you everyone for joining us today on such an important debate and discussion. As mentioned, my name is Hushneara Mich. I am a specialist in low carbon procurement, and more so in the public sector and within the supply chain domain. I head up Centre for Sustainability, and overall today's discussion and presentation is about the implementation of low carbon procurement to fight against climate change. Before I go any further, there's a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to go through. I'm working from home, and many of you maybe also be working from home. I don't have the best broadband, so if I do disappear, please bear with me and forgive me. I will be back. And as TC mentioned, questions, can you just put them into the comments box? We'll pick them up at the end and we can have a discussion, or I could answer your question depending on what's put in there. Before I go any further, next slide. Okay. Before I go any further, as mentioned, much of the work that I'm going to discuss today originates from the PhD. And as a result, there's 3 people that I have a lot to thank for. They are the people that sat on my research committee and people I respect highly. So let's start off with Professor Ken Peaty. He's guru of sustainability, head of marketing and strategy in the business school. And my understanding is a long-serving member there. So a lot of people from the business school, if you're here, you should know him. The next person is Jane Lynch. She is a specialist in procurement, a reader in it, and she works out of the Cardiff Business School. I've worked very close with her and respect the work that she's come out with in recent years. And finally is Anne Toblik. She used to be in Cardiff University. She's moved to Nottingham University. She is a specialist in sustainable supply chain. And these are the 3 people I've learned a lot from, and I do highly respect their work. They have contributed heavily in terms of the research I'm going to present today and guided me through the path. So thank you. There's another organisation I want to give thanks to right now, and it's ESRC, so Economic Research Council for Britain. And they are the people that funded my scholarship for the PhD. So thank you for them. Without them, I wouldn't be here presenting this PhD data analysis. Before we go any further, I want to just give you an overview of the structure in terms of the presentation today. The first part we will do is give an overview of sustainability and low carbon procurement. That starts with this diagram. Then I'll go into the main body of the actual research and what came out of it. And I could tell you a lot came out of it. Due to the level of data that came out of it, I will present to you proposition statements and give you advice and close the actual discussion in that sense with the Q&A element. So I'm aware there's some people that have come here and they messaged me privately and said, I've heard about sustainability, I've heard about low carbon and climate change, I don't know what it is. So I think a good point would be to start right now to give you an overview of what sustainability is. There's a myriad of different diagrams that outline sustainability. This is one of the ones that people do use to give beginners an overview of it. So sustainability has three elements: the environment, society, and the economic side of things. And we often refer to them as the planet, people, and profit. So if we start with the environmental aspect, the environment has different aspects to it in terms of air, land, and sea. What we're trying to within sustainability is manage and maintain and regenerate that aspect. So there's something here for us and future generations. Within the society element, there's UI, groups and communities, organizations. We, in some sense, live on planet Earth, and therefore we build up societies there. The economic side is something we naturally seem to drive or have been driving the last few years. So this is where profits sits. This is where business industries sit. And what we're trying to do is balance the environment, people, and planet to make sure there's something here for today and for tomorrow. Unfortunately, what we have been faced with in recent years is a major issue, and we also refer to it as the environmental problem, the environmental issue. And Ken has had severe discussions with me, in-depth discussion, and we've come to the conclusion, and he said it very openly, there is no such thing as environmental issue, there's no such thing as environmental problem. The problem is us. So let's start off. The biggest issue internationally in the world is climate change. And the critical causal factor of climate change is the increase of GHGs. GHGs are greenhouse gases. Notably, the main greenhouse gas we refer to is carbon dioxide. It represents 80% of all greenhouse gases. So these greenhouse gases are emitted from human activities. So in some sense, we are the cause of climate change. And when you say, what does it mean? What does it mean? How do we cause this? Is it just a fuel I'm putting in? That is the tip of the iceberg. When you actually look at greenhouse gases and how they are emitted, much of it comes from industrial process, products, services, and what sits in the middle of all this is the procurement, the production and consumption debate. What we produce, what we consume, what we want and what we need, and potentially what our greed from the environment is the problem here. So when we take a step back, if we look at the production and the consumption side of things, we actually have a pivotal point of procurement. Business and organizations and we as individuals procure items, and if we control what we procure and procure sustainably, factoring aspects are low carbon, reducing the carbon as we buy, we could actually support the fight against climate change. Without this, if anything, if there isn't an environment there that's healthy and happy in some sense, there is not going to be a world for us to live in. And that's where we say it's the biggest agenda in the world. To achieve sustainability long term, we have to fight against climate change. And we're just sitting within production consumption, and we say probably 80% of organizations' carbon footprint, not footprint, emissions overall is sat within this area. When we talk about it, we talk about the pivotal point of procurement and what procurement can do. So this leads on to the slide about low carbon procurement. This is a fairly new discipline that's come through, and it brings together different areas to define low carbon procurement. So what does it really mean? Some people have heard about it, some people haven't heard about it. It sits within sustainability. What we're in essence trying to do is lower the carbon impact when we go out and procure. So for beginners to this, when you actually think about procurement, to take a step back, procurement is just buying. But we use the form word procurement in public organizations. So this is the definition of low carbon procurement, a process whereby an organization, so organization, business, government, seeks to procure, easy way of saying going out to buy, goods, service, works and utilities with a reduced carbon footprint through their life cycle. So if you think about the life cycle element, we're looking long term, not short term, long term. And in essence, what it should do is reduce the overall organization's footprint, considering direct and indirect emissions. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but That's the overall definition that's coming through and what we're trying to do with it. So in terms of the actual research into low carbon procurement in Wales, it was a 5-year study. It was a 5-year PhD study and then more recent work. So in terms of that, I had a flavour of what's happening in Wales. That was a research site. And when people talk about why Wales, why not Wales? Wales is a very unique place on the journey to sustainability. Wales is one of 3 places in the whole of the world where sustainability is built into the constitution. So the foundation, the Government of Wales Act, section 121, let me correct myself, actually refers to the pursuit of sustainability. And we are in a very unique place. And as a result, there's institution research that happens in the area of sustainability in Wales, which might not happen in other places or may not be as advanced. And at the same time, if the government is pursuing sustainability, they'll be looking at all aspects of their activity and industry to make them more sustainable long term. One thing we can take away from Wales is Wales may be doing it, but every country at some point or another will be looking at this agenda. So when we look at Wales overall, in terms of research, I research into the public sector. Somebody may ask why the public sector? It was a strategic move behind it. It started with an organic pilot study, which I did a year before, which actually looked at all 3 sectors to see what is actually happening. What can I actually do a deep dive into to understand low carbon procurement? And it was the public sector. So when you actually look at the public sector, it's governed by the government, directed by policy. They have to act for the public interest. So if low carbon climate change is a problem, they have to be supporting the agenda. They have a very structured process and they've been asked to buy sustainably. They've been asked to factor in low carbon. And at the same time, when they go out and buy, the procurement exercises when they're over £25,000, which is very easily done in the public sector. For these kind of tender processes, they have to go through strict process in terms of putting out a tender, bids coming through. There's different processes they could follow, but overall, it's meant to be quite structured to sort of bring out transparency, fairness, equality, should they get audited overall. Public procurement follows public procurement directives, but at the same time, they're also governed by sustainability directives, legislations as well. So in terms of the research, the methods I use for this part of the data that I'm going to present is interviews. There were 50 interviews in. Secondary data, so document analysis, looking through tender documents, looking to the actual policy, reading between the lines of what people say in the actual interviews and what I'm actually seeing in terms of discourse coming out through the documents, and a research diary, which gave me a view of what was happening in the early years, so what has changed. And to be honest, a lot has changed in the last few years as we ramped forward in terms of the climate emergency. So when we look at it, the research methods came from a few different areas. One unique part about this research is that when we actually looked at interviewing, or when I went and looked at interviewing, I interviewed 2 groups. And usually when you look at public sector procurement activities, you tend to start to looking at documents, for example, tender documents, to see have they factored in low carbon, have they followed the procedure, what have they done? And if we don't do that, quite often people may go and speak to the actual procurers and suppliers at times. What we don't see is that conversation high level in government and policymakers in their agency. This is a unique piece of research that covers the voice of the government, their agencies that are put in place to direct procurers to buy sustainably, and then the actual procurement, procurers and procuring organisations, their voices. The unit of analysis was the public sector in Wales, but the voice of 2 groups were heard between the lines. So to give you an overview, in terms of the government, we're talking about obviously Welsh Government, their policy department, or in terms of their agencies, the likes of Carbon Trust is reflected in the actual data, and other agencies that they use to instill the procurers, advise them, direct them. In terms of procurement organisations, we've got the likes of 3 local authorities, higher education through different spectrums. So we've got consortium of higher education. So when the higher education come together, sometimes they come as a consortium to buy when they're doing mass buying. And also here I've got NHS Wales. I'm quite well known there. So NHS Wales, they are trying to position sustainability strategically and buy more sustainably and low carbon factored into it. So these are the organizations represented in there. As an initial review of what is happening in terms of low carbon implementation, I looked through documents and had a few early discussions to understand how should it be implemented? What is the initial agenda? So what came out, low carbon procurement is implemented or intended to be implemented through the procurement process. So as you have a process, and quite regimental, strict process, you have documents, you have tools, you have processes. You could, for example, fill out a tool and might ask you to go and ask for certain documentation from your supplier. So in terms of that, there's a whole suite of tools and policy that governs it. Another big aspect within it is a circular economy concept. Within some of these tools, the circular economy concept features quite heavily. So this diagram here refers to designing waste out of the system. We're actually keeping products more in use, regenerating the actual system. So this is about the circular economy. Why is circular economy actually connected to low carbon? If we're making use out of what we already have and wasting less, we're going to have less burden on the actual environment, and climate change will be reduced. So that's how the circular economy is factored in. This circular economy goes in different spectrums and it can get quite technical, but it's about eliminating waste, keeping things in circulation. So new words we're going to hear in the next few years is remanufacturing, not just recycling, remanufacturing, talking about repairing our items, not just single one-time use of it. So the other concept is life cycle costing. So let's not look at the price of it today, let's look at this price of overall. Is this low carbon overall over the life cycle? Other things are supplier requests. As I mentioned, you could complete documentation, and that documentation will give you an overview of what you need to ask from your supplier, and perhaps you might go and have that engagement. But as I mentioned, public procurement is quite strict. You cannot just go and have a conversation with a supplier and say, this is what I want, unless you've gone through a certain process. If you go through the simple open and close process, where you perhaps shortlist and take people to different rounds of the tendering process or framework process, that means you might not be able to have those conversations. Whereas if you're buying a big project from the actual supply base, you may be able to speak more closely with them to say what you want. But again, engagement is very strictly governed. You cannot just speak to one supplier and not speak to the other. It has to be a fair table where everyone can be spoken to, have the opportunity to be heard. The next thing in terms of filtration of implementation of low carbon procurement is through the tender and evaluation weighting. So when you go, obviously complete this documentation if you are a buyer, and I'm aware there's some buyers here. At the end, we will go at, as a procurer, you will actually evaluate the answers and give it a weighting, a bit like a teacher, but not so much, but you will weight it. And then from that, your score will go over to the next overall score and build up the picture of who wins that tender. So that's the picture of how everything works. And you would think it was that easy, but it's not. So in terms of the research questions, before going out into the field, I went and did the pilot study. I also looked into the literature to understand what are the important things to look at. And what came out is we need to learn more about drivers, barriers, and enablers. So these research questions are directed in terms of looking at that. Question 1 specifically is, what are the major drivers? This should be happening, but what's actually the driving force in the public sector? How does it operate? So what are the major drivers? How do they operate? The next thing is about the barriers and enablers. What's actually helping? What's hindering the process? Where do they operate and where do they interact? So in terms of the actual research questions, they're initially guided by institutional theory. Due to the fact that the public sector have quite a strict guideline in terms of how they procure, there's a lot of institutional theory within that, coercive pressure and peer pressure and things like that. So it initially was guided by that and resource-based view. But as we move forward, we started actually looking at the data more closely, and I started actually building up a closer picture of what's happening through abductive ways. So as new data came through, we built up codes and analysis through that way. So in terms of the data that came forward, there was a lot of data. And what also came out from the actual literature and the data is that a lot of this data is represented on different levels. And that should be respecting that level rather than just saying these are barriers, these are drivers, these are enablers. Let's take a step back where I analyze the data on macro level, which is looking at the societal perspective. This could be, for example, a driver could be legislation. but at the same time, look at the connection meso level. This is where organizations and groups work together. And at the bottom is micro level. This is about individuals. To connect you to this could be you as an individual on micro level, go to the place of work, and you are there in place to buy sustainably because it's within your legislation, macro, meso, micro. With the data, it went through rounds of coding and it was presented in multi-level analysis thematically, and then it went into concepts and direction in terms of where the data actually headed. And then finally, because there was so much data, I built it into proposition statement. So someone that's looking new at it and want to know, what does this mean? What can I take away, generalize it to another sense, where propositions with statements were put forward. So in terms of drivers, I will first go through them in terms of the levels. To start off with, firstly, when we talk about drivers, on macro level, on the world perspective, there's a quote here from sustainability consultant. This is a consultant that works for government's agency, directed here to help the procurers buy sustainably and in terms of low carbon. And this is his view of it. Low carbon procurement is largely driven by legislation. There's a lot of sophistication. So he talks about the slickness of doing it, where it's driven by legislation. It's not an option anymore. This is how it's done. But he would say that because he was one of the people that directly supported the guidance of this policy that came through. And he has a lot of experience. So he may know that it's governed by legislation, whereas procurers perhaps don't know at times. So the procurers didn't say it was governed by legislation, but the procurer said on meso level, we follow the procurement policy. And as part of the procurement policy, low carbon is taken care of. Within that policy, they fill those documents and those tools, and they go through certain process and ask you a question. It might say to you, go to the suppliers part of the tender and ask for a certain document off them, and that will instill low carbon. So some of the procurers initially felt that. Bear in mind, I was in the field for 5 years. As time went by, the procurement policy wasn't looked at that favorably, but people did say that it was a driver at meso level. So that's what's there. One major driver that isn't covered as much in terms of government and the literature is the individual, the you and I, the passion of people. So on micro level, on the individual level, the NHS we talk about, with me, yes, we understand there's legislation out there. We understand there's a lot of things there, but really day to day is the passion of the people that are actually there pushing it through. And one word that came through forward was champion, entrepreneurs in industries, these individuals making it happen. And this is one of the key quotes that came out, where it's about people being passionate and actually using that role within the institution to push and drive through low carbon. So I'll give you a few seconds to take it in. But one thing it does do is highlight drivers are not just the legislation that some people may think. It's not just the policy, it's the you and I, the individuals that go into work. And that it seems quite simple in some levels, but it does get a bit more complex as we go by. So that's a few of the drivers. I won't give all the drivers because there's many others, but some of the key ones are here. So when we look at enablers now, enablers were analysed on macro and meso and micro level. Start off with the worldly things. So we have a policy maker talking about the first quote, talking within the first quote, saying we're drawing together in a more integrated way, aligning Wales. This is a senior level policymaker that makes a lot of decisions for Wales, governs how things are put forward, how industry should respond, and so should in terms of government departments. The nuance within this language and also some of the other conversations with government was the fact they're not actually as aligned, but they're trying to become more aligned. And if I'm quite honest, I've seen them in more recent years becoming a bit more aligned, but I think there's acknowledgement in their quote that was hidden behind the words that they're trying to align more because they weren't aligned before. So, but I think with the climate emergency and the response they expect from industry and procurers, this is going to stampede in terms of their response. On meso level, so this group level, where one thing was in terms of enablers was language. So this is coming again from another support organization. So they're here to help procurers come in, advise them on how to put together a tender considering carbon. So they would say, we don't talk carbon. They, when they say they mean procurers don't understand it. We focus on resource efficiency language. And I think it's an open platform. We don't often talk about carbon as such. We talk about a different language of resource efficiency. So some of the words they'd use is life cycle thinking, circular economy, cradle to grave, cradle to revival. Think about the output of it, the circular economy. This is how they project carbon. They wouldn't say, ask your supplier to reduce carbon by this percent. They would say, look at the waste that might be coming out of it. Look at the circular economy. Can we get it done in a different way? Look at a life cycle analysis. This is how the support agency sees things. Other actual supporting elements on Meso level are supplier certification. As they're going through the procurement process, procurers have the opportunity, if needed, to ask for certification. For example, the Green Dragon Award, ISO 14001, if they think it's a heavy impacted area in terms of low carbon and climate change, you can ask for footprint of that product. And there's ISOs cover that aspect as well. So they would ask for these certification through the process of the procurement. They would also get audited. So people auditing them said their audits were great, and we sanction people if they don't follow the process, if they don't factor low carbon in. When I asked the procurers, well, we feel we're always getting watched by Big Brother. We get audited, but we don't get supported. So, but nonetheless, audits were seen as an enabler, as a coercive pressure on them. Trade-offs were seen as another enabler. When you think about trade-offs, you think about the concept, if you reduce waste, there's a good chance you can reduce carbon. If you're not buying in the first place, you're going to reduce carbon. Again, I mentioned procurement tools. Procurement tools were mentioned a lot of the time in different ways, if I'm quite honest with you. Initially mentioned as enablers. As the years went by, they would be talked more as barriers. And also when you got more close to the procurers, they open up and say, they're technical, they're in this way, but we'll discuss them further. But at this point, I would say they were discussed as enablers to help people do their job and understand carbon. And within this actual tool or tool and suites of tools, circular economy would be factored in, looking at resource efficiency would be factored in. Another enabler was the environmental category. When you actually look at low carbon products, sometimes some procurers said it's really hard to get them through because people just see them as more expensive, but that's partly because they're more expensive upfront. So the way some of the procurers, especially in higher education, so the consortium of higher education, so in terms of the universities, the way their procurement department would get it through would be by creating a separate category. So they might buy stationery, and they might have general stationery, recycled content stationery, and they would go through those processes, creating a new category for the environmental actual product to allow it to get through. So that's how they would do it, and it worked well for them. Another thing, another term that I heard quite often was this win-win, and win-win up front. If you reduce waste, you reduce money, and you reduce carbon, great. But this win-win also had this other element of win-win up front. If it was cheaper today and it also reduced carbon, that's great. But when it was win-win over a long period of time, it wasn't so easy. So that's some of the things at organizational level we've come out with in terms of enablers. One of the key enablers was a micro level. And this is something that stood with me for a long time. And that's something I more and more heard about when I went out into the public sector. It isn't my money. There's a sense of duty. This is the public's money. And this is a quote that stood with me. We have to act with what the public want. These were the things that I would hear. The public want this. So my job is to deliver this. And this quote came from the NHS. I heard very similar content from different sectors, whether it's higher education, local authority, but the person actually procuring felt a sense of duty to the public to do the right thing. And this enabled the process. Over time, what I identified this as was public sector motivation. These people are motivated to serve the public, to do the right thing within their role, and delivering low carbon meant they're supporting the public with the overall agenda of fighting climate change. So we've got so far drivers and we've got enablers. So we've got the big things driving it and the enablers are helping it. Things seem okay so far, don't they? And this is when we now come to the barriers. If I'm quite honest with you, the amount of barriers that came through was phenomenal. It was to a point that I had pages and pages written, recording I was going back to. And also, as I got closer with some of the participants, they would open up. Initially, some of the procurers were hesitant to speak because they're quite scared of losing their job, saying the wrong thing. Some of them perceived I was potentially from the government, so what if I went back, said something that would cost them their job? But as I built more rapport with these organisations, I built trust with them, they were able to open up with me. So the barriers, majority of them were on Meso organisation level, so I'll deal with them separately. But firstly, what I'll go through is the macro and the Meso. So macro are the big worldly aspects in terms of government legislation, and then micro, which is the individual aspect. So when you look at a macro level, a lot of the procurers came back. I would say a lot of the procurers came back and said, we don't have leadership from government on this. Where they may say they want to do this, but then they do other things. They want to cut our budgets, and we can't do this if we're looking short term in terms of our budget. So lack of leadership that came out. Though government said they were leading, procurers didn't feel they were leading that much. I do believe things have changed slightly in the last few years, and the government is trying to cohesively bring everyone together and move forward. But lack of leadership is something that came out quite strongly. Lack of alignment, that was another thing. They would say, well, they'll ask me to go buy sustainably, think long term, and then ask the finance department to cut half my budget. Well, I can't do this long term thinking with half my budget and still having to go out and buy. But another thing that actually was taking place and potentially is still there is austerity and the long term effects of austerity on macro level. We obviously went through budget cuts, which affected the local authorities quite heavily, and they struggled with resources. This translated people losing their jobs, losing budgets, effects on morale. So on macro level, on governmental level, there's aspects of austerity measures being taken place. On meso level, there are a lot of barriers, but we'll deal with them again separately. When I go on to micro level, the individual level, the essence of feeling the pressure, the cutbacks that I mentioned, the loss in numbers in the team, and feeling the pressure. These are the kind of quotes I would hear quite often. I'm feeling demoralized. I still got to do the job that I need to do, but we have less people in the team to support me. And the lack of awareness. Lack of awareness came in two ways. If you're so stressed in your job, you may not be receptive to information that's given to you. And at the same time, sustainability, low carbon is something new that's coming through. And for some people, and if it is, they may not understand it at the first stage. So there was a lack of awareness in that way. As mentioned, most of the barriers were on Meso organizational level. I have 2 pages just to cover this. So start off with Meso level barriers is lack of leadership. We spoke about government leadership, the lack of it. Now we talk about organization leadership. I have to say things have changed a bit in the last year or so, but again, people reported the lack of leadership. Lack of engagement was a major barrier. The procurers didn't feel they're spoken to. They felt they were spoken at. We're told to do this. We're not part of that conversation. If we complain or we raise it, we're just given another document to fill out. It's not a two-way dialogue, and some people are scared to speak up. So that was another aspect. So in terms of lack of engagement, another part of the engagement was with the suppliers. Procurers go, because I'm at such a fast pace, I can't actually go and have that dialogue with my supplier. So they don't know what I'm trying to say within the procurement exercise. And the suppliers, in some sense, they would come back and feedback to procurers. Well, I didn't know you wanted low carbon in it. Your tender didn't suggest that. So lack of engagement and the process of public procurement being so strict. You can't, whereas you and I could go to a corner shop if we're buying something or go to the high street, say, no, I didn't want this, I want it in this way. You can't that easily say it. You have to translate it within documents much of the time in public procurement. And there's assumed knowledge that the person writing that document has an understanding of climate change and low carbon. They're translating it and engaging with the supplier, potential supply base through that document. Supplier base is bidding back and with their response, and that's how you're going forward with it. Another barrier was culture. When you think about culture, people sometimes take that for granted, but if I'm quite honest, culture is so deep rooted, it's something that manifests within procurement culture. Traditionally, when you start going 10 years back, the quotes that would come are, well, we used to buy it cheap and stack it high and get it out for the NHS. Now they're asking me to do it differently. It stresses me out and things like that. But there's different ways around culture. What they've tried to do within the the actual exercise in the NHS is recruit by culture. So if you want to work in procurement, do you believe in sustainability? But again, culture, even if you mix culture in different ways, naturally is a culture that already exists there. So culture was seen to be a barrier within procurement on Meso level. Outdated policy and tools, but people said in the early years there's outdated policy and tools. To be fair to Welsh Government, they have taken that on board from my work and other researchers' work, and they have brought out a new policy statement, and they have looked at the tools. So they're in the process of transitioning from it. But again, outdated policy and tools mentioned. My worry sometimes is with Welsh Government, when they don't like a tool, they bring in another tool, and they don't actually look closely into why didn't the original tool work? Is it because we need to change that? Do we really need to jump to a new tool? So overall, there was I would say, a strong voice of outdated policy at one point, but it has been looked at. Tools as well, budget cuts. Obviously, I mentioned austerity at top level. Then we've got budget cuts. This is how organizations get affected. And we've got lack of resource. So obviously, if you've got a budget cut, you've got lack of resource. People are struggling to get the tenders out. I remember one thing that stood with me quite closely was when one procurer said, I appreciate this. I love the idea of climate change, but I've got 4 tenders and they need to be out yesterday. I haven't got the time for this. I haven't got the resources. Our department's been cut in half. I've lost half our manpower here. How do I do this? And then you start to realize the actual nuance in a lot of these conversations about resource and how important it is. Other aspects was cost in the sense of price. When it was obviously looked at life cycle, perhaps it could have been cheaper, but people start looking short term. And if it's looked at being expensive today because saving money over 10 years, it's not that easy to filter through. So that became a barrier. And another aspect was knowledge. And I talk about knowledge on different levels within my own work, but knowledge and assumed knowledge. Let's not assume our procurers understand low carbon procurement. Let's not assume they understand climate change. And sometimes some of the worry is that sometimes we assume they understand it and they're afraid to say they don't understand it. They don't get the training, or if they do, it's like a one-day training, now off you go. And this knowledge base was a struggle with some of the procurers. And I think people that have had a lot of training, support, guidance did better. But knowledge and assumed knowledge was seen as a barrier. Skills, and I talk about lack of skills on so many different platforms: procurement skills, sustainability skills, low carbon skills. That is a huge element within Wales across the board in terms of procurement. Another thing that was a barrier was short-term thinking. When you think about short-term, you're not thinking of the long-term impacts and aspirations. But if you've just had a budget cut and you've now been told you haven't got much of a team to get this out the door in terms of your tender exercise, and you still need to buy, you start thinking naturally we're short-term. And finally, this is one that really frustrates me, is this tender valuation and scoring. So imagine you put the tender out and all these responses come back, and then you only give in the tender, you give sustainability, which factors not just low carbon, factors all aspects of sustainability, a percentage of 10% weighting. And then your price element is at 40, 30% in the tender. What do you think is going to win through? And not just that, 10% could cover, for example, the whole aspect of social value within it. So that would also mean the community, that look also at sustainability, where in terms of low carbon. 10%, I just personally don't think is enough, but that was seen as a barrier. People do have the opportunity to change it. Some people did say to me they actually put it as 20% or 25%, which I saw in a recent tender, which was fantastic to see. But overall, these are the barriers. One key barrier I want to talk a bit more about here is skills. I won't turn into Tony Blair, but in terms of skills, I have to say we don't have the skills we need in procurement. And so in terms of procurement, the buying aspect of it, then we don't have the skills in terms of low carbon procurement. And this isn't a one-day course. This is a long-term aspiration that we have. We have to support the procurers. And this isn't just in Wales, it's across the board. And I think the worry that we have is some of the things that have happened in recent years in terms of people feeling demoralized, cutbacks, people struggling to get by day to day, their morale being affected, means that at times the skills that we did have, we are starting to lose it in Wales as well. So I've seen recent reports saying that the procurement profession that was struggling with skills anyway is going to struggle further in the next few years. And this is because people are leaving the profession due to what's happened in the turbulent few years, which will mean we're in a further skills deficit. So these are the meso level barriers. As I mentioned, I got a whole load of data, and it was months of coding, recoding, analyzing, trying to take the nuance from the conversations, understand what does it mean, and trying to get it to proposition statements so someone else could read a statement and understand how to implement or get more of a flavor of what's actually happening, showing the connections of from macro level to meso level to micro level and how things filter through. And it wasn't an easy job. It was a hair-pulling exercise, if I'm quite honest with you. But at the end, I've come together with a few propositions. I haven't put all of them in here, but the ones I will talk to are 4 that look at a few different things from weighting to leadership. So to start off with, proposition 1, the lack of governmental leadership on macro top level leadership will negatively affect organizational leadership, which in turn will lead to the withdrawal from policy supporting LCP. So in some sense, the previous look at, well, if government not supporting it, our organization's not going to support it, naturally people will just withdraw from low carbon procurement. On the flip side of that, in essence, what it says is leadership on government level is vital, on organization level is vital to get this through. So that's proposition 1 that came out from the data. Proposition 2 looks more closely at austerity, but also as uncertainty. So proposition 2 looks at austerity on macro level, translates into reduction in budgets, human resource, and adversely affects the central policy team to respond. And in turn, it affects the ability for procurement at meso level and at micro level, where it affects the impact of low carbon procurement. So if you've just had a budget cut, you've had people were lost in the team, you may not be in a productive place to be responding as effectively as you would. On the flip side of it, what is the nuance would be that combination of key factors at micro level. So the people that are really passionate about low carbon procurement, people that are motivated to serve the public, if they're given resource at meso level, the human resource, the budgets, the skills, the knowledge at meso level, they have the ability to go out there and positively influence the implementation of low carbon procurement. These are key elements that are needed for low carbon procurement. You cannot do it without the resource, without the skills and the motivation of individuals. And then looking at other propositions, I look more closely at the actual procurement process. So when we look at these, I've got 2 propositions here. So proposition 3 looks at the introduction of procurement tools. And I have to say one thing about Wales, we love tools. There's a problem, there's a tool out there for it. And I think that's where some of the procurers get a bit scared to speak up. If you say too much about the tools, they'll give you a new tool, another tool. So here, introduction of procurement tools at meso level positively influences LCP, so low carbon procurement implementation in the procurement process. So at the beginning, when you introduce a new tool, whichever one it is, it's like something new, a new takeaway that's open. We all want to try it. So we go out and try the tool. We might like it, we might enjoy it. As time goes on, things change. So the reverse of that, the proposition 3.8 is the actual multiplication, the misalignment of these procurement tools over time on organization meso level hinder the implementation of low carbon procurement, and it reduces the motivation of procurers at micro level. And some procurers, we don't want to speak up because we get more tools, we get tired of it, and sometimes better just to be quiet. So that's one proposition in terms of the tools. And it's not just the ones that the actual procurement policy governed previously, any tool that is used or the suite of tools that are used. So proposition 4 looks at meso level, and this tension that really frustrates me. At meso level, the tension between carbon, so low carbon, and the cost element during the evaluation scoring stage hinders the implementation of low carbon procurement. This is when you weight low carbon at 10%. This is when you haven't factored it in properly, and price represents 40% or 30%, and quality comes in. you just can't filter it through. There are different ways about it. Sometimes you could turn the whole tender into sustainable tender. So, for example, in Wales, what we did do recently when we bought transportation for South Wales, we turned it into sustainable tender for transportation. So everything is looked through that lens. Or perhaps the other ways for smaller or medium-sized tenders, you can actually look through it as increasing from 10%. Or if you view climate change with such a big impact, which should be, potentially it has its own category. But so there's some of the propositions I put forward. If we start looking at it, there's a lot of information I've given you there. But some people will be looking at me like, what can I take away from today? And when you start looking at today, I would say one of the major issues we have with low carbon procurement implementation is how it's positioned. My advice would be, if you are a policymaker that's actually sat in for today, think about planning and strategic positioning of low carbon procurement. Our procurement function, as of late and for a long time, has been operational. They are not looked at as a desired profession compared to some other ones like the legal department. If you position it long term, these budget cuts shouldn't heavily affect this department. But you need to strategically plan it through. Rather than introducing more tools, new tools, fresh tools, understand what's happening overall. And that means position it strategically. Next element, what can you take away? Engagement and training. Engagement at all levels. So when you talk about engagement, I'm talking about engagement from government to the procurers with the suppliers. It will only work if we could all engage and understand. And that means training as well had taken place. Don't have this assumed knowledge that people know what's happening, and not one-off training. They need regular training, because as things change, they need to also upskill and reskill. So another thing in terms of what you could take away, if you're actually drawing upon your actual tender, you're a tender specialist, look at the product specification or service specification, build it into that, use your tools for that, and give it a fair weighting in your evaluation. And give it a fair weighting. I honestly don't think 10% is going to be enough to fight climate change. Well, I would say 20, 25%, reduce price if you have to. Well, so I would say to weight it in that way. Finally, this is probably my message to industry, message to public procurers, and I haven't perhaps gone through it as much as I would have liked to in terms of actual innovation. This is a unique opportunity to innovate. We don't have everything we need for today or tomorrow. There's an opportunity to look at more reusable items, remanufacturing items. And this is something I would say for procurers, to have that conversation. If you really don't think your suppliers can offer what they have for what you need for tomorrow, have that conversation today. And at the same time, for suppliers, I know some suppliers sitting in today, see this as an opportunity to create new innovations. If you could have, for example, reusable PPE, try to innovate. We're used to having single-use items. More we keep in use, less impact we have in terms of climate change. That's my message today. So as I conclude for today, we have gone for a few things to catch up. I've given you a quick overview of sustainability and low carbon procurement. I've run for the research in terms of the actual approach I took with it, the actual findings, and also the propositions that came out with it, and gave advice for people implementing. And as I close up, I just want to thank you all for taking part today, and for appreciate how important this agenda is overall. And also thank you for the Sustainable Places Research Institute for having me today.
Great, thank you very much. That was really interesting. So if everyone could start posting any questions you might have in the chat, they're sort of slowly coming in. I'm gonna take chair's privilege and ask you a question before we go. So this is a long way out of what I know, but I have played around with a few of the tools, certainly around low carbon, and I guess I was, my sense is that they're very much a black box, and actually getting to understanding what the life cycle emissions of even something simple like a pair of jeans is, we're not quite there in terms of actually measuring it. So I guess I'm curious to know how the sort of uncertainty in those tools might affect, the procurement process and sort of people's faith in that process, I guess.
I would say negatively affects people when they don't understand the tools, or they can't appreciate it as much as they perhaps should. And there is a tool that's sort of circling around Wales in terms of taking a risk assessment of sustainable and low carbon. It's actually quite a good tool, but it's a heavyweight. You start that tool, you'll be there talking about chemical waste, and our procurers are not in tuned on that level to be completing a tool like that. So it makes people feel quite withdrawn from the system, or at times when they fill out the tool, they forget about it. And by the time they come to actually put the tender out, it's misaligned. The goodness that you put in that tool isn't reflected in what goes out.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting problem. All right, we've got a question here from Christopher Stevens. Would you consider that good practice weighting overall for social value sustainability should be closer to 20% in public sector procurement?
Absolutely simple answer. I see minimum 20, if not more. If I'm quite honest with you, yes, the UK government, what they did do from January, if you want to actually go out and bid, from January this year, they put social value at 10%. People had social value at 10% before, many people. I don't think it's enough. I think we should be looking at 20 to 25% minimum. If we have to take it from another category, we take it from price.
Great, thanks. So Marco Lombardini has asked, what are the decision support system or examples of tools that you're implementing to define strategies and prioritization of actions on top of scenarios and besides the cost benefit analysis that received a lot of academic argument, I guess, and can't stand as a single unique tool?
Can you repeat that for me?
Yeah, so it's written on the chat here. So essentially, I think the question here is asking for examples of tools that you are implementing that help to sort of prioritize these different strategies.
There's different types of tools. So there's obviously footprinting, which is quite complex. In the public sector, when they do that, they get specialists in to do that. In terms of bringing in the actual footprint aspects, if you ask them for ISO, that covers footprints within that product, that's one. In terms of tools, Wales was using strict tools, a suite, so SRA, the Squid, and these have been reformed and changed, and then we're moving more towards the actual social value, TOMS, which is themed outcomes and measures tools. But again, the tools are only as good as what you put in it.
Great. Thanks. Are there any other questions at this stage? I don't see any more coming in. So with that, just like to say thanks again for attending the, coming in and giving a talk with us. We've really appreciated it. I found it extremely interesting as somebody who doesn't think about procurement in a systematic way. It's been interesting and fun to hear you what you're working on. So thanks again, and we'll be having another one of these in 2 weeks, and so hopefully we will see some of the attendees here in 2 weeks. So many thanks again, and have a good rest of the day. So,
thank you for having me as well. Thank you everyone for joining. Take care.
All right, see you.